Now we're going to focus on the top 3 cycles in our topic of ecology. The first cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Going back to what you learned with elements and molecules, the element nitrogen is one of the top 4 elements of the human body. It is also the top element found in the atmosphere. So it makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. The molecule N2. Now remember, it's a molecule because it's two of the same, not a compound. Nitrogen is found in DNA, RNA, specifically proteins, because it's found in the amino part of the amino acid, the NH2. So that's very important. Now, all living things give off waste, urine and feces, and nitrogen is a common component in feces and poop and pee. And that's what gives it this strong smell, especially if you ever smelled animal urine, you have that strong smell. And that's the ammonia, the NH3. So fish will excrete waste, bacteria can break that down into ammonia, and then that nitrogen can be absorbed by plants and algae, and then fish then would eat that, plants and algae and so forth, and then you have that cycle. So let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. First, we have N2. Because nitrogen N2 is so strong, because of that triple bond, because of the covalent bond, even though it's a sharing bond, it's a triple bond, so it's very strong. It can't be broken down. Okay, so something in nature, something that God has created, has to be there in order to break down this nitrogen so it can actually be used later on. So the first thing that we're going to focus on is nitrogen fixation. This is when N2, the nitrogen gas, is broken down and then reacts to form something new. So nitrogen is going to be broken apart and then is going to react with hydrogen to either form ammonia or ammonium. So what can do that? Bacteria, nitrogen fixing bacteria. So that's very important for you to know that bacteria can have a symbiotic relationship. Okay, another way in which we can break apart nitrogen is through either some extreme heat, lightning, forest fires, or lava flows. So even though there's something bad with maybe a forest fire or a lava flow where it can destroy life, it is also used for good to break apart nitrogen. As you can see here, we have nitrogen in the air. Well, if we follow the left side arrow, the nitrogen fixing bacteria that's on the roots of plants, this nitrogen fixing bacteria is breaking down the nitrogen, turning it in, as you see at the bottom, ammonium, and basically it can be used later on. Okay, if you follow it on the right side, you have more nitrogen fixing bacteria, and then you also have decomposers which can help in that process. Okay, so not only bacteria can break down this nitrogen, certain fungi can break down the nitrogen as well. So there's 2 living organisms, bacteria and fungi, that can break down nitrogen, and then non-living things we saw on the previous slide, lightning, forest fires, or lava. Now ammonification, that's nitrogen mineralization. Basically we're taking the N and converting it into the nitrogen and converting it into ammonium. This is usually going to happen when animals die. You have decomposers such as bacteria and fungi that break down the nitrogen in the body, the animal's body. Nitrification basically is taking the ammonia or ammonium and turning it into NO2. So this is very interesting. We start off with N2, the nitrogen gas that can't be used. Bacteria and fungi break it down into ammonia or ammonium, which is NH3 or NH4, broken down even more into NO2 or NO3. This can be done by bacteria again. So bacteria basically is adding oxygen to the nitrogen, breaking it down, changing it more and more. And this is very important so it can actually be used by plants. So denitrification is basically done by bacteria again. This is going to remove the nitrogen from the ecosystem and converting it back into the N2. So here we have the completion of the cycle. We start off with N2, bacteria and fungi break it down into NH3, NH4, then bacteria, fungi can break it down even more into NO2 or NO3, and then the bacteria is going to remove the nitrogen and then send it out. It's going to use the oxygen and get rid of the nitrogen. That N2 becomes the bacteria's waste product, and that goes back in the ecosystem. So it's a cycle. So what's the human impact here? The use of fertilizers. Nitrogen can be a cancer-causing agent. Now we move into the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle focuses on the element carbon. Carbon with hydrogen is organic. So sugar, which is C6H12O6. This is an organic thing. If it was once living, it is organic. So salt, on the other hand, is NaCl. There's no carbon in it, so it is not organic. So carbon is found in rocks, it's found in fossils, it's found in the atmosphere, it's in the gas we breathe out, it's all around us. So the focus here is carbon atoms are going to be recycled. Here again, we're going to have a cycle, just like the nitrogen cycle. You're going to start by taking it in, and then you're going to release it. So let's start with number one, plants take in CO2. We breathe in oxygen, plants breathe in CO2. This is done by photosynthesis. Primary consumers eat the plants, and they go through a process called cellular respiration, where as they eat the plants, they break down, especially the carbon that was in the plant, and they breathe out CO2. So plants breathe in CO2, animals then breathe out CO2. Okay, not only are the animals breathing out CO2, but there's carbon inside their bodies. So when an animal eats another animal, that carbon can be transferred, broken down, and made into different compounds in the animal's body. So when that animal then dies, or the plant dies, there's still carbon there. So when that animal starts breaking down, decomposing by fungi or bacteria, the carbon is then recycled, and as fungi and bacteria break it down, they will release more CO2, more carbon dioxide. When we burn fossil fuels, okay, a fossil, because it was maybe a fossilized tree, coal, if we burn that, CO2 is going to be given off. So where did that CO2 come from? From the carbon that was in that plant, in that tree. So here we have that cycle. We start off with plants breathing in CO2, animal eats the plant, they breathe out CO2, but not only do they breathe out CO2, but the carbon is inside them, so when they die, okay, it gets broken down by bacteria and fungi. Now there's also carbon in the oceans. Basically, carbon can very easily be passed through the water, okay, into the water from the atmosphere. Plants and plankton will use this for photosynthesis, and so there we have a continual cycling or recycling of the carbon. As we burn fossil fuels, as we said before, as people burn fossil fuels, the carbon will go into the upper atmosphere, and the burning of fossil fuels is called combustion. So that's a term. Any of these particles that go into the air from the burning, from the combustion, are called particulates. Okay, some examples of particulates. So this cycle repeats over and over again. So you can look at that cycle and kind of study that a little bit and get that idea of what's happening. Now we move into the water cycle. Make sure you know that the water cycle is also called the hydrologic cycle. That's another name. There's really no start and stop point of the water cycle, but it does go in a continual loop. As you kind of see there, it doesn't matter if we start with precipitation or if we start with evaporation. I usually start with evaporation. You have water, you add heat energy, the water then evaporates, it gets cold, it then condensates, and then it rains or snows. That's precipitation, and that water falling from the sky then collects, and that can be considered runoff as it does not go in the ground. But if it does go in the ground, that's called percolation. Now, if you look in the very center there, we have transpiration. Now, transpiration is when the water comes out of the leaf at the end of photosynthesis. This is water coming out. Now, if water comes out of the leaf, it's still in liquid form. Then when it evaporates, that then would be called evapotranspiration. So let's take a look at some of these terms. Water is a compound comprising of two elements, oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen has a negative charge or negative attraction, while the hydrogen has a positive attraction, and the hydrogen is going to be attracted to the oxygen of a new compound. Now, surface tension is the attraction of those water molecules on the outside of the water droplet, forming the dome shape. Let's first talk about vaporization or evaporation. This is when we're adding heat, we're going from liquid to gas. We said transpiration is that 6H2O at the product side. It's kind of like some people call it a plant sweat. It's not really plant sweat, but basically the little lips, the little guard cells are opening and closing on the plant, and so as that happens, the water comes out, and then when it goes from liquid to gas, it's called evapotranspiration. We're kind of combining evaporation with transpiration. So transpiration, water coming out of the leaf, then if that evaporates, that whole process would be called evapotranspiration. Then we have condensation. A great example of condensation would be a cloud. This is when we're going gas to liquid. So in the atmosphere, it's colder, so the water, okay, that is in a gas form, starts slowing down, starts getting colder, and then it turns back to a liquid. So a lot of people say a cloud is a gas. It is not. It's actually a liquid. Little tiny liquid droplets suspended in the air, and they're resting actually on something called condensation nuclei. This can be dust, this can be different particles floating in the air. So these little water droplets are sitting on top of those things. Then when the water droplets start getting larger and larger, which is called coalescence, basically they get heavier and then they fall. And then that leads us then to precipitation. This could be rain, snow, sleet, hail, any type of water falling from the sky. Please do not confuse this with perspiration. Perspiration means sweating. Precipitation is rain falling from the sky. Then we have freezing. We already learned freezing is going from liquid to solid. This can be in the air when the little water droplets, it's so cold, start freezing, turning into snow, and so on. Then when the water comes down, it's raining. Okay, visualize it's raining. When the water hits the ground, we have two options here. It can either infiltrate or it can run off. So if it infiltrates, that means that the water is going to go into the ground. Infiltrate, go into. Now, a specific type of infiltration is called percolation. Percolation really is the same thing as infiltration, but it's just more specific. Infiltration means going into the ground, but percolation is saying it's going into the ground through little spaces and pores in the soil. So the little spaces and pores, okay, water is going through those spaces, so that's called percolation. So infiltration is just more of a general term, percolation is more specific. Now, if the ground is filled with water and the water can't go into the ground, all those spaces are filled up, Well, the water has no place to go down, so it has to move on. That would be runoff. So an example of runoff is flooding or maybe a waterfall. Okay, so runoff is when the water can't go in the ground, it has to move on. Another example of runoff is if there are no pores in the soil. So let's say you have concrete or a road or a rock. The water can't go in there, so it's forced to run off. It's melting, and we talked about that. Heat is entering the solid, turning it then to a liquid. If we have a lot of snow, this can actually lead, if you have a lot of snow, this can actually lead to runoff or flooding when all that snow starts melting in the springtime. And lastly is groundwater. So when the water goes into the ground, basically all we're saying here is it's water in the ground. So when we have percolation or infiltration occurring, rains, water goes into the ground, the soil holds the water. So that water that's in the ground is called groundwater. Okay, and that's it.